Cognitive Biases Deceives Analysts and Destroys Actionability. My name, that's Rainer Michaeli. I happen to be the Institute for Competitive Intelligence Director, sitting here in Germany, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and today we have with us Eric Garland. Hey Eric, say a word.
Hi Rainer. Very excited, and as I was telling Torsten Bill that you and I have been colleagues working on and off together for almost 20 years now, so I'm very pleased to be here. And
come on, people will know about our ages, so don't mention something like 20 years in the past professional life. That's not me. I must have been too young for that. Come on. No, honestly, this is all about the future, I guess, when we're sometimes looking back to the past and recognize, yay, we're getting older and older. But there's a fun part about that.
It's better than the alternative. So
exactly, and the fun part is you meet people like Eric, really a fascinating guy. Nowadays living in the US again, so he's sitting over there, I'm sitting here in Europe. Early morning for you, Eric. That's good. So you have full energy to go through the slides. Yes, and here's a little house rule, so to say, for all participants now joining us. You can communicate with us, unfortunately, via microphone. That would be a bit too noisy, I guess, and too many people have to shut up. No, you can use the chat function that's on your panel, a little screen, a little window popping up where you please send questions to us. We will then later on tackle them, i.e. I read them out loud and Eric will try to answer them. Otherwise, we have about 40 minutes of presentation, i.e. Eric will run you through the slides and then maybe 10, 15, 20 minutes, whatever it takes for this Q&A session. Eric, I think you start off and introduce yourself a bit to our audience and then take it from there. I'll shut up if not that you'll fall apart or something like that and I have to jump in. Come on, Eric, all yours.
Thank you, Rainer. Yes, I hope that I do not melt down into a puddle of incoherent random thoughts. If I do, I count on Mr. Michaeli to save this presentation and your valuable time. But in the meantime, I'll introduce myself. My name is Eric Garland. I've been in the competitive intelligence and forecasting, foresight, strategy space for about 20 years now, and my work has started in the more what I'll call classical competitive intelligence, finding information about competitors and competitive market trends. And then I went to work in Washington, D.C. for a think tank that did nothing but future trends, more long-range 5 to 20 year forecasts for the same kind of corporations, Coca-Cola, GM, Ford, Siemens, a great number, and government agencies and well. And what I discovered is that they both have a lot in common. We're talking to people about things they don't know and getting them to change their mind, hopefully, and see a different set of possibilities. So when I look at intelligence, I look at it in a much broader sense. And I've written 2 books on the subject. One is called Future Inc., How Businesses Can Anticipate and Profit from What's Next, which has to do with how anybody can look at the future. There are some very simple tools. And my second book was called How to Predict the Future and Win, and it's a satire about how we don't. And this kind of brings me to our topic today, about my current research, which is about cognitive bias, the very specific psychological and sociological mechanisms that lead us away from all these smart things we supposedly know. So my question today for this session is, we have very smart intellectual and decision tools, and yet our decisions frequently suck. Not always, but we can look at any number of missteps in the marketplace and things we would hope that executives would have found. And my question is, why? Why do we seem to go away from the rigorous tools that we have and make decisions that are seemingly nonsensical, that leads us in the wrong direction, sometimes as individuals and very often as complex groups. And of course, this is not as slick and easy as SWOT analysis or Porter's 5 Forces or Balanced Scorecard or any of these lovely quantitative and qualitative tools we have. We sometimes still miss the mark. And so that's my current research, is figuring out exactly why we won't use the tools we already have. So the basis of my assumptions here is that humans have ill-fitting cognitive patterns due to evolution. And we have Stone Age brains that developed in a tribal setting and that are being used for collaborative decisions in complex environments. And by complex, I've heard a lovely term for what complex really means in an organizational environment. It's not complicated. Everything's complicated. How to make a cheeseburger is complicated. Programming a computer is complicated. But complex was explained to me by someone at the Defense Department in the Pentagon in the United States, that a complex system is something that involves so many different parts and dynamics. No one person can explain all of it. That even at the extent of our knowledge and our intellectual powers, no one of us can explain a system. We just simply may not know enough, and we need others. And once you need other people to understand things along with you, hilarity ensues, as you've probably all witnessed in your own organizational lives. And when in the comments and questions, I'm sure if all of you are, if you're even interested in a topic like this, then you've worked in organizations where you have your own war stories, and I'm sure they're hilarious, and I look forward to you sharing them with the group. So my question is about where do we include something as complex as cognitive bias, where our thinking patterns are leading us away from clear understanding. Let's say I do the old Boston Consulting Group 4 quad for market share and market growth. You know, where does outcome bias or a focusing effect or a bias towards the status quo or the sunk cost fallacy, they all 4 of those, by the way, you know, relate to any category of a business that would, you know, fall into that. Well, that's our dog. Well, we have to keep going with it because, well, we just do. Good money after bad, the sunk cost fallacy. We don't really have a place to discuss those. It's seen as esoteric, but I would submit that a lot of what we see in individuals and group dynamics, you know, rather than missing quantitative tools, we are missing an understanding of our own minds, our own social dynamics. You know, so SWOT analysis. There's tons of cognitive bias that would fit in to just how we would fill this out. Our strengths and authority bias. If somebody powerful in the company tells us this is what our strength is, we're gonna go along with that. Dunning-Kruger. We don't understand our weaknesses because we don't understand the skills and competencies and strengths of the competition, because we don't know enough. Our perception of threats can be overcome by what I call good old dayism, which is back in the good old days, things weren't as bad as this. We see this all the time, but there's no, you know, these concepts are really far beyond the simplicity of some of these tools, and yet they're going to need to come in to our thinking. And so I want to explore just some of the world of cognitive bias research. And the heavy lifting, this is great. I'm kind of lazy. So if somebody's already done massive amounts of work for me, and I can jump off from there, it's fantastic. This is all coming from the world of clinical psychology and, to a lesser degree, behavioral economics. Many of you may have heard of or have read Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, who I believe won a Nobel Prize for economics. And they are working in this area of figuring out how the human mind works and how we perceive value in the short and long term, how we really perceive risk, and what those patterns really are. And there's a whole list of cognitive biases, and we could do 8 hours on all of them, and you would recognize all of them in the world of intelligence and trying to tell somebody about this emerging situation, and they just won't listen. If you're an intelligence professional, this is the heart of what you do. So I'm just gonna, I want to sensitize you and seduce you into looking at these subjects, and I'm going to give you some examples where, and based on some my own stories of hilarity. And I'm going to start with one category called the social biases. These are cognitive biases that are based on our social patterns, how we get along, how we relate, how we rank in a hierarchy, things like that. And the first, which has probably gotten some of the most attention in the last few years, it's come into popular, it has come into popular renown online, particularly the Dunning-Kruger effect. And the definition of this is the less a person knows about a subject, the more confident they feel about their opinions on it. In the United States, we have this culture of cowboy independence, and we have a distrust of fancy things and fancy thinking. And that's all well and good, but when you're talking about making healthcare policy, or you're talking about geopolitics, nuclear nonproliferation, we also throw out expert opinion with that, and it tends to be kind of dangerous. And if you wanted to sum it up in a phrase, it'd be, I know as much as the so-called experts. Healthcare policy is just a matter of common sense. And I point out the national, even though this is in English, which has become, thankfully and luckily for me, a lingua franca in the business community, where many executives the world over use it, you have to point out national culture here. The words common sense don't translate the same in every language. Not everybody goes, yes, a simple idea is better than a complex one. That doesn't fly in France as much. It is not in vogue in Austria. So this is the way it would be expressed in America particularly. But you throw out the expert and, well, this is just common sense. Let's not listen to people that really know what they're talking about. And the people who tend to suffer this, you'll find them in the workplace of people who are accomplished in one thing, and they think their expertise carries over to everything. Physicians, my father runs a farm store, and he talks about if you get a physician or an attorney who come in, they'll try and explain to you how a two-cycle motor really works and how you should really repair it, and they don't realize that actually that's its own specialty. You probably don't know. So it can affect the smartest among us. Also, mediocrities who don't really even understand what expertise is at all. So I think the negative effects here are easily avoidable catastrophic mistakes. You do not, if you do not consult experts in the field, and you make mistakes that would have been easy if you just asked somebody who knew. So this is all about the rank of experts and their authority in society. So that's an example of a social bias. Status quo bias. This one carries across all cultures. It is a bias towards the status quo, that which is currently today, the belief that the world is a certain way for a reason, that it represents statistical normalcy, and that it is likely to remain in stasis. If you were making forecasts without understanding political trends in the United States, if you were making forecasts based on stability and rather than, oh, we might be at the edge of an inflection point here in the world, then you're exhibiting some form of status quo bias. The assumption that all things being equal, well, I guess things will stay the way they are. Well, a quick read through history books will teach you that that is not based in fact, but it is a very standard bias. We humans have an interesting dichotomy. We are excellent at adaptation and change. We can adapt to new environments fairly easily compared to, say, jaguars or elephants. But we also like stasis. We like things that are stable. So we have a tendency to bias our decisions and our assessments of the world according to that. And then the key phrase, we're in a recovery and everything's getting back to normal. We've seen recessions like this before in the 80s and 90s. It's no big deal. This is something I heard after the easily predictable banking crisis of 07, 08, and 09, depending on where you were in the world. And I was in competitive futures based 2 blocks from the White House at the time this happened, and I was briefed, for example, about what I was briefed on what people in Congress were being briefed on, that if we did not pass a bailout within 2 days, that the US dollar would melt down. And it was the most extreme situation any of us had ever seen. And then I was going into businesses, oh, this is a recovery and we're just getting back to normal. No, this is unprecedented. But the bias is towards, no, this must be like everything I've seen before. So, and common sufferers are eternal optimists who, well, it always works out. Read history, it doesn't work out all the time. People who are just generally terrified by change, which is everyone at some point or another, and especially people who are already winners in the current system. If you're more likely to want the status quo to continue if you're doing really great. But what that does is it often ignores the agency and the effect of people who are excluded or disenfranchised, who have a real interest in upending the current structure. Again, look at the United States right now for that. So, and negative effects are wide varying, but mostly the inability to prepare for either threats or opportunities because executives fail to take a situation seriously enough because their assumption is for stability when that might not be an appropriate response. Another category is called memory bias, and the memory biases are distortions in decision making that that stem from how we recall past events. And in the world of police, they know that if you are interviewing witnesses more than 48 hours after an event, that their memories will diverge, that the facts they remember will get filtered by their emotions. They will get further and further away from a similar understanding because that's just apparently how our brains we write narrative. We are continually rewriting narrative. We are putting it in different contexts. We are incorporating new information and making new stories out of the events that we recall. And this is called memory bias, and it affects intelligence and decision-making quite a bit. This is a very American concept of good old days. This is a picture of a television show from the 1950s. I don't know if any of you overseas would have seen it in rerun. It's called Father Knows Best, and it was a situation comedy that sort of highlighted the warm family trends of the 1950s, with the so-called nuclear family. That was so called because it was the nuclear age. It was after the development of the hydrogen bomb, and that was a phrase on a lot of people's mind. We're in the nuclear age. And this was the first time that you had basically a pair of parents and just their children. Humans had been living for the past several thousand years with multiple generations, but America had become so prosperous and we developed the suburbs that people were moving out just into that combination of family members, which was historically unusual. And there's a lot of nostalgia for this period of time. But if you look at the statistics involving crime, domestic violence, almost everything, workplace accidents, child mortality, infant mortality, things are demonstrably worse. Racism, all the things in the United States are just demonstrably worse, with the exception perhaps of jazz. And so we look at a nice shining picture of, oh, remember when everything was great, but if you look at every other statistic, hospital accidents, car accidents, life was worse and it's better now. But the bias towards thinking that things were easier 20 or 30 years ago is called good old days bias. The assumption that the past was more positive than it is today. Key phrase would be, it's so scary today. Everything's terrible compared to when I was younger, like when mortgage rates were 14%, and the Russians were ready to nuke us within a minute. Because that's the 1970s and 80s, and when you have, you can see good old day bias in action here when a presidential candidate, such as Mr. Trump, comes out and says, America's gone to hell, it's a hellhole, we're going to make it great again, as if the 1970s or the 1980s were somehow an era of greatness. It assumes that you have a nostalgia for the past, and not incidentally, if you want to look at the deeper psychology, you're further away from death when you're younger. So this is an easy sell to people, right? But common sufferers are people who are nearing retirement age, people who watch too much cable news television, and people who just don't. They suck at history in general. And the negative effects are the inability to identify positive opportunities, because the focus is on why the environment is hostile as opposed to the 8 million reasons you can start new businesses, or you can find new markets, and you can communicate with new people. This is, you can take this one bias across all of business, all of government. A look at the past is really a wasted opportunity, because there's tremendous opportunity in the present, and the future is richer than that, because we can build new things and forge new alliances and understandings. So this is a very caustic, it's a very caustic cognitive bias that masquerades as happy family photos. Hindsight bias. The best way to describe hindsight bias is that once you arrive at the future, oh yeah, back then we knew that. We were all on top of that thing that just happened. Of course we knew about that. It's the tendency to filter past decisions through current understanding and assuming greater wisdom and analytical skill in the rear view than we really had. Key phrase might be, well, of course we knew .com was a bubble on the verge of popping. Those stock prices, they just made no sense, despite the collapse being something few people actually predicted. I mentioned I grew up at a farm store. I'm from northeastern United States. I'm from a state called Vermont, which is very rural. It's the smallest economy and the most agrarian. And my father ran a farm store. My grandparents ran dairy farms. And my father sells cow manure, for example. And pretty much every business model that I can't explain as easily as I can explain cow manure, we get manure from cows so you can fertilize your soil. You don't want to collect it yourself. We have it in a bag. We buy it low. We sell it high. Simple business model. Anytime there is a business model you can't explain in a couple sentences, I get very nervous. And so during the first .com, which was incredibly fun, if you were in a tech city, I was in Washington, D.C., so much fun, so many open bars, so many people made so much money working on websites that never existed. No one knew what they did. And I said, look, this is failing the cow manure test. And many people, I remember, did not agree with my assessment. Oh, you don't understand. Things are different now. I'm like, I doubt it. And it blew up. And as soon as it blew up, everyone's like, oh, of course we knew that was all fake. Oh, okay. In retrospect, the hindsight bias, oh, the things I know now, the fraud behind it, Enron, the accounting irregularities, in hindsight, we know that now, and we go back and we assume that back then we also knew it. And it really stunts our ability to understand the next situation, because we're assuming greater skill than we have. And this is a common thing to suffer if you're in a very political environment where admitting a mistake is considered weakness. I hope it comes across that when I talk about these subjects, that I have. This is not an admonishment. Everybody's stupid, except for me, of course. I hope a lot of empathy and sympathy comes through with this, because in a lot of cases, when we're making these mistakes, we're really just expressing the unexplained tensions in our political environment, our organizational culture. And there are places where there is an open intellectual culture where, you can take risks and you can make mistakes, and that's okay, but they're rare, and much more when you have very competitive environments. People don't want to ever look dumb, which is tough, because complex worlds, you're going to look dumb occasionally. We're not going to know things. You need to be exploring. So this is, people who they're going to bias their thinking because they feel they must do so in order to remain politically viable, and that's a problem. And it's not a character weakness in an individual. And when we have situations like that, the only way to really get around it is to have the CEO and board of directors or high-level management that very intentionally creates another culture. But this particular bias is a danger because old failures get rebranded as understanding. Oh, we knew that all along. No, maybe we didn't. Let's talk about why we didn't. We don't talk about why we don't understand things. It's a problem. And the only way you can get around that is having a corporate or organizational, if you're in government, culture where these things are acceptable, and that can only come from the top of the organization, and it must be cultivated for a very long time. Decision biases, another category that are how we choose. This is where behavioral economics come in and they're doing a lot of great research on this, particularly Kahneman and his colleagues. So notational bias. Now we're going to get, for all of you who are in MBA territory, and you work in organizations that no doubt have a heavy quantitative management style. This is really important, and you may never have thought of it before. The definition is the tendency of metrics to include more successes or false successes and fewer negative experiences in metrics, skewing how effective a decision was. In other words, we're only able to make decisions based on the numbers we take down. So key phrase, we've evaluated ourselves based on internal metrics and we're doing great. Here, look at this number. Obviously the strategy is great. I heard somebody once say that a lot of business executives have physics envy, that when you look at the college journal, the university journals, that have these heavily quantified theses on marketing or accounting or whatnot. And I'm not talking finance, but other things. They're saying, I've heard from a professor of physics who said, they all want to pretend like they're us, and they're going to have this peer-reviewed thing. They're going to have this peer-reviewed process where they, just viciously tear each other's numbers apart until they arrive at something that looks like the truth. But you just have physics envy. You're just looking to lay as many numbers over something to make it look like you've got rigor. And the common sufferers are the, quote, scientific managers who trust their numbers over intuition. And I'm not saying, by the way, I am a native qualitative thinker. I am, my background is linguistics and geopolitics, and I have come in my experience, particularly working with companies that are chock full of physicians and engineers and other people who want to see your homework up front. They want to see the numbers. I have become a great fan of quantitative analysis in my old age, but my native sense is that there also needs to be a narrative story along with this, and I think quantitative rigor is good, but it also can be fake, and overconfidence in harmful decisions is what can result, because the numbers told us this is the right thing to do. The best example of this is the mortgage crisis, when the mortgage markets in the United States and then spreading to the rest of the world collapsed. They had all the risk analysis that anybody ever did. They had formulas. Oh my God, it was safe as mother's milk, except it wasn't. And Nassim Nicholas Taleb talks about fat tail risk, that yes, it's in complex systems. Yeah, you have a low percentage chance of failure, but the effect of that failure will be impossible to calculate. And so it is. Short-term benefit bias. It's a tendency to choose quicker, inferior benefit without regard to the probability of either outcome. And this is the heart of thinking fast and slow. Giving up what we want now for getting what we want most. And in a world where we report quarterly numbers, this is very important. A key phrase might be, well, we just don't have the money to invest in a green building. We have a limited budget, and we'd prefer to spend it wasting electricity and water for the next 35 years rather than spend a little more getting this up to LEED silver status. Common suffers pretty much everyone, and we all do this in our personal lives. We do it in our organizations. We were just in general we are responding to the needs of the minute over where our organization is going and where our lives are going. But when I say damn near everyone except futurists, that's futurists on their best day, not most days, because we're no different as humans. We just hope professionally we're pushing people towards the future. But the negative effects can be everything going to hell. Ecological collapse, general inconvenience. If we have a world of interconnection where we're constantly responding to the crisis of the minute, we're unable to plan for a more robust future. So it's one of the greatest threats I think we have as organizations. The SEMMELWEIS reflex is in the decision biases, and it's really one of the most dangerous, and it is named for a man named Dr. Semmelweis, who I'll explain. It is the tendency to reject or ignore all new data if it contradicts existing theories. And you can see this in almost every field has some version of this. We have existing theories that tell us how to analyze the world, and it might be Michael Porter's theories of competitive strategy, and it might be, it might have to do with how people survive surgery. And the key phrase might be, what do you mean that we surgeons need to wash our hands before operating? Dr. Semmelweis, you're a lunatic. This is a true story. The man who the man who discovered essentially the theory of microbiology and infection and surgery was a surgeon named Semmelweis, who noticed that when he washed his hands and wore a clean apron to the surgery, the notion of all white or clean was new, and in the hospital culture of the time, surgeons measured their almost like the concept of a black belt in karate, is you start with a white belt, and when your belt is dirtier, when you get to that black belt, it means you've practiced so much that you are obviously a master. Well, in the surgery, it used to be the more covered in blood and gore that your apron was, that meant you spent a lot of time in the surgery, and that meant you were more of a master. Of course, that is a nightmare for septic infection, and Dr. Semmelweis realized that not only when he changed his clothing but he washed his hands, he noticed his patients did not die after the surgery, and when he presented this to his colleagues, they literally threw him out of the profession. He was never allowed at meetings again. He died in an insane asylum, penniless. It broke his heart that he was thrown out of his own profession for something that we all know today to be the cornerstone. And so this is about the people who might suffer this, and it goes everywhere. But practitioners of venerable professions with large bodies of best practice, and a smaller group, people who just don't give a damn about infection. But that's a very small group. Most people care about infection. And negative effects, significant blind spots in decision-making, and dead patients. But anytime you have a phrase, well, I've been doing this for 20 years. I've been doing this for 30 years. It often carries with it the implicit, well, and therefore I'm probably right about this. I'm excited to be wrong about things, and it's good. I get ample opportunity to, but the worst things can happen in a professional culture when we start assuming that just being stuck on one theory for 30 years without constantly attacking it is anything but substandard. So this is an admonition for us to continue exploring and continuing to challenge our own assumptions. But it's very hard, because once people make reputations based on certain assumptions, separating them from those is kind of tough. So I could go on and on. We got I think we're about minute 35 there. There's more of these to discuss. I'd like to take questions and explore, go further on any other cognitive biases or.
Yeah. Eric, thanks a lot. I think we owe all a lot of gratitude to Mr. Semmelweis. Interesting bias. I haven't heard about that, to be honest. But yeah, it makes sense. I mean, come on, if you're counting bodies after the fact and that's it, life becomes a bit bizarre, to be honest. Anyhow, yes.
The joke in medicine, the joke was, well, you know, we show off our successes and we literally bury our mistakes.
You only count the survival.
Well, and I will
and
tell
only
you.
they can. By the way, only they can talk about it. So there's no problem about those who died, I guess. In these days, of course. Come on, don't be too cynic here.
I'm very impressed by the medical culture, and this is new. Is they are still getting away from a paternalistic, authoritarian bent. I'm not sure about the culture in other nations, but I know in the United States, the notion of what's called evidence-based medicine, which is large longitudinal studies of large patient groups to measure the outcomes of certain accepted practices, is barely 20 years old. And many, many older doctors hated the idea because the notion was that every doctor, and this is when the profession was largely male as well. It is now 51%, the incoming classes are 51% female. So we have a gender equal split for the first time in history. But the notion was each sort of a great man theory of history. Every doctor has his own special approach. And that is being blown away now by this, you know, yes, it may be your approach, but it kills 3 times as many people, so stop it. And since these days of, you know, of denying infection and all that, the peer review culture of medicine, where you do not get to have pride of authorship. If you write something, we will check it, and if it's wrong, we will talk about how wrong it is, and you may not blink, you may not shy away from it. And I just wish that in the strategy world, in the intelligence world, that we had a fraction as much intellectual honesty about that, because it could only ever help our clients, I think.
Oh, I fully agree. I mean, this medical discipline is some strange, to be honest. And yes, they have some regulatory bodies which is sort of self-controlled. So it's like a medieval guild when they do their own sort of peer review every now and then. But come on, we have a bigger picture here, and this is intelligence.
Sure.
So, anybody having questions, please type in your chat window, and I'll try to read it out, and Eric will try to answer. So the first one coming up here from Nice. I was wondering, to what extent do the values of an analyst play a role in bias?
Let's see, with the values of an analyst. You know what? I just take a second with that. I think if you've got, you know, if you are politically expedient and you, let's say this is just a deeply personal question. If you are someone who values your own career above, say, the best interest of the organization, I have noticed in the world as a futurist, doing the analysis of the long term, there's way more money in telling people exactly what they want to hear. There's way more money in telling them things that do not disturb them. My personal decision was I would rather not be asked back than lie, or then, you know, I feel that it's my job to tell you things that are upsetting sometimes, because it may be very important for your organization. But that's a deeply personal value, and many people, you know, don't share it. They say, hey, I want to get asked back. I want more budget. I'm not going to tell you you're wrong. And I can tell you, and this goes in competitive intelligence as well, when, let's say, I'm thinking of a very, very specific project where a company was getting ready to invest $50 to $100 million in a new technology based on a new type of financial market, and we discovered that it was run by some of the same people that had structured the mortgage market, and there was a heavy degree of fraud in it, and they had already made the decision they wanted to do it. And they hired us to check with the assumption that we just go check, and then they prove it was all cool. So the cognitive bias was based in, and it was one of the best projects my company ever did. We told them very specifically, no, I am sorry, and they got nasty, and they didn't pay for 4 months, but we spelled we made sure every single detail was right, and they practically attacked us for coming to these conclusions, and it turned out to be entirely fraudulent, and we saved them $100 million. But it would have been way easier to go, nope, looks good from here. No, we did fine. We found some good news at the end of the day. Yeah, you're right. All good. That's that's a matter of personal value, and how you want to. I mean, it's not even how your colleagues perceive you. I think it's how you sleep at night. So that's one example. Rainer, you've been doing the analysis game in all over the place for a long time. How do you see the values of particular analysts?
Oh, I perfectly agree to what you just said, and it's all about culture as well. You made this point about, do I get some penalty if I'm wrong or right? Mm-hmm. Then of course people will go for less risky, more conservative kind of, we did it before solutions rather than trying something logical but risky. So just this on its own is such a huge bias to one end, or preference of picking certain solutions, which of course is a value thing. I agree to that. Come on, here's the next question for you. I'd love to hear some techniques or advices to avoid falling into these biases.
I think the only way you can do that is to name them first. If there's no, I've got just a few listed on this slideshow, and this will be available to you. You'll be able to download that. It'll, I think either Rainer can put it up on his site, or I also
we'll have it on our slides, the whole webinar, so the whole slides and our tone as well.
Excellent. There is a much larger number, and there's actually this wonderful large poster. I have yet to order it, but it's like 2 meters in either direction, and it maps out all of these decision and social biases, and there's just a great number of them. And if you just go through and read what's been identified, and you can, send it to your colleagues just as a, hey, check this out. One of the great things about pointing out cognitive failures is that it doesn't necessarily need to be painful, because you won't be thinking about you doing it. It's just like, you'll be, oh, that's Frank. Oh, that is Jane to a T. Oh my gosh. It'll be everybody else. So you can learn about this while making fun of your colleagues you don't like as much. So
what poster are you referring to? Is this a certain author or part of a book or website?
I'm trying to think of the guy's name. This is just off the top of my head. It's on my site somewhere, but I'll hit you with it. But there's also I'm trying to think of the two cognitive psychologists. They have an expanding slide deck on SlideShare that has all 300 of these, and that's where I took my inspiration for this, because as I read through, I was like, yup. Right, okay, yep, seen that, and I was like, oh, this is the new hotness for intelligence. We got to get into this stuff. And I had never seen, so many people discuss these phenomena that are indeed all over our organizations. But I think we might have a tendency, if we are aware that our group is affected by cognitive bias, there's a great tendency to lay that strictly at the feet of individuals and to say they're stupid or they're jerks or something to that.
And by the way, if you're talking about literature and sources, obviously Mr. Richard Holmes and his book Psychology of Intelligence Analysis, published 40 years ago, was pretty much a milestone in sort of talking about or recognizing at least there are biases in intelligence analysis. Richard Hoyer, this is a good old CIA analyst, so he definitely had a different type of sort of cases to study, but his book is still available, of course. It's complementary, courtesy of CAA. So if you go to the CAA.gov server, you'll find his book there ready for you to be downloaded. And I really recommend that as a starting point, at least, to think about biases as something natural. And this is kind of somehow coming back to the question that we just discussed. Are there tools, techniques to really avoid falling into them? I recall that Richard Hoyles in his book makes a point. Some biases are system inherent, which means they are there. And even if you know about them, you can't compensate. It's kind of bad luck thing. Whereas others, arguable. You can train analysts. You can kind of have this checklist or playing the devil's advocate game just to make sure, okay, we pinpoint biases, and of course then prior to decision making we can reduce or at least compensate for our wrong analyst perspective. Any advice from you, Eric, along the lines of literature or kind of tools, group dynamics, methodologies coming up when you have to sort of deal with a bunch of managers and you're afraid, but they might be a little biased?
Well, I think the best, two books that are in the popular sphere right now. One would be Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, that explains the different types of, short order thinking and long order thinking, and he explores how that plays out in all forms of economic situations and executive decision making, and that's hit the popular consciousness, and it's written in an accessible style, so that's good. I'd have to say the work of Nassim Nicholas Taleb, also extremely popular, where he's talking about fat tail risk and fooled by randomness, and his fundamental theory, if you're not familiar, is that we have a lot of fat tail risk that is poorly understood, where there's a low probability of something coming to pass, and it has an inordinately high impact. And he personally made an enormous amount of money off the housing crisis by going, all right, we're going to set up these hedges here because, yes, if the housing crisis, if the housing market doesn't burst in a bubble, then we have relatively low cost, but the upside, if it does, is 20,000-fold. And so he personally, that's one of the ways he came to prominence, in addition to his writing, was calling that correctly and putting his own money on it. For me, Competitive Futures actually had a model where we named the banking crisis down to the month. We just didn't create a hedge fund around it, and I feel stupid. I wish I would have done that differently if I had to get it. But Nassim Taleb's books, Fooled by Randomness, The Black Swan, and I'm forgetting his masterwork title here. There's the third one, which is all about this type of risk analysis. It just explores longhand our assumptions about risk and how we are, our perceptions are biased. Otherwise, how do you avoid it? I think you get into this topic and you just look at the hundreds of different biases that are identified and learn to, almost like zoology, learn to identify them in nature when they come out. And I find it really interesting when you talk, Rainer, about that there's some systemically inherited and some individual. So how do you avoid them? I think you can, like some of the for example, like the notational bias, that's one that you can do training around to say, let's look at what our management tools are and what are we missing? So what if, what else is out there, and are we really quantifying for that? And if so, do we need to add? Do we need to subtract tools? That's something that you can go out and really build something new in. If you're talking about the politics of hierarchy among executives, I don't know how you do. That's tougher. If you've got a bunch of, if you've got 9 senior vice presidents and they all want to knife each other to be the next CEO. And it's a matter of you got to pick which horse you're going with. Fellas, we think you might be involved in a certain amount of, authority bias that's I mean, let's be real, that you will be in the parking lot not long after that. There are some situations, the structure of the organization is just, you're going to be kind of stuck with it. And I used to think that 90%.
Hello, Eric. I think we lost Eric now.
Meant what they were really looking for. The context is the majority of the art here, and pulling out financial information and getting interviews from executives at other companies. That's rote. You can train a monkey to do that eventually, but knowing how to present that so they don't throw you out of the boardroom, that's the art here.
Here's a sort of add-on question to what you're just discussing. Initially, you said, well, you better understand their biases and you recognize that they're there. But of course, here's a question kind of, aren't we only able to recognize biases once it's too late, i.e. once they occurred? So in hindsight, I understand it's easy to point fingers and say, okay, you've been stupid, you haven't seen it coming, you should have sort of changed your perspective or whatever. But yes, how do we do it before it happens?
I think I would put it, you can do it in real time with some of these. Hindsight bias, obviously, we have to wait until the future and then go, you're talking like you knew what the housing crisis was coming. Nobody did, you didn't. That takes some time to develop. But there are those that you can identify in nature, and maybe if you use some of these terms, it'll sound less like an attack on somebody and more of a recognition of the realities of how we process information, like status quo bias.
Come on, Eric. If there are 200 plus biases and we all sort of hunt them, wouldn't this mean we're paralyzed and we'll never come to any decision because we're all afraid that after the fact, after the decision making, we'll be stepped by, well, you've fallen for this kind of bias here?
Well, I think you can identify them and maybe use your powers of persuasion, like with status quo, when people go, oh, well, look, it's not going to be that big a deal. Well, let's take a situation that is developing and is an extremely serious. We have a rogue presidential transition right now in the United States with people that seem to think that they want to retreat from NATO. Anybody who is looking in a business context going, oh, well, come on, it's probably going to be okay. And, we've seen this kind of thing before. No, status quo bias, dude. That you are assuming because it is useful for you not to have things change radically that they won't change radically. Well, that's called status quo bias, and you might want to think about it. You can pick that one up in real time. Well, it's not easy like it was,
But 3 years ago. Let's pick this example. I think we all agree that the United States or even the global political scenario seen as pretty complex as you define it initially. It's too complex for anybody to understand everything, all implications of this Mr. Trump coming to the table now. So how could you pick just one bias here, i.e. businesses are usually like status quo driven? It doesn't do justice to the whole Trump coming to the White House now situation. So isn't this exactly another bias now from your end? Okay, now I'm very provocative and apologies in my trial, but come on, here we go. It's a real life case.
I like that kind of thing, though. That's like I said. And if we're going to call this the McCain, we'll call it the Garland phenomenon. When you understate understating the importance of something, when you really want to be screaming and crying, but that would be impolite. We'll call that the Garland reflex. How do you get at these in real time? I think the only way you can is to know that is to read up on it, and it'll be just one more field of knowledge for intelligence. I think one of the things that makes this field so interesting for me is I have a very wide range of things I'm interested in, and I like business strategy, but I like geopolitics too, and I like interpersonal psychology, and all that comes into bear when you're in the intelligence game. And I think this is just one more rich avenue, and it's fairly new. So for all of you who are listening and interested, not enough has been done on this. I'm writing and I'm doing work like this, but we need you too. there has not been a definitive canon of work on this subject in business management or government leadership at all. So we're all learning together.
I think the other way around is we have to accept there are limitations in terms of understanding systems, back to the US or political systems, but we have to somehow make decisions anyhow. So maybe some people can be smarter than others and taking the wrong models, but coming to good decisions, which might not be what we expect, but it's at least something to survive.
I think you make a really good point. You can have all the tools you want, but at some point you're going to have to come to a decision and live with it. One of my favorite phrases comes from on this subject comes from Max Nelson, who is another very experienced competitive intelligence analyst, and he said, "All intelligence is wrong. It's just a question of how wrong and was it useful?" Because, like you were saying, no analysis can take in the breadth of activity going on in the world. We are condensing the world down to a narrative that we hope our clients, internal or external, can get with and understand and hopefully improve. But by a definition, we will get it wrong about the competitors, because even if we talk to 3 of the executives at the highest level, the CEO, the CFO, but we didn't talk to the chief operating officer who had a completely different angle on it, it's incomplete. It's wrong from a certain perspective. But the question is, did it help? Did you make a better decision on that? And one of the great failings in certainly competitive intelligence is, we don't have a way to go back and do longitudinal studies the way that the medical profession does, to go, all right, we made this decision for this blood thinner or for this regimen for diabetes. How is it 5 years later? Look at your patient population. How is it doing? Because most of our work is secret, we can't, we don't do that. we can't for many, many good reasons. So, we're kind of stuck with, at some point, we're going to do things that are by definition flawed, and we still have to do our best with them. And I think the tools like the recognizing the biases like I've been talking about today, there's no magic formula here. It's just, learning so that when we formulate our next analysis, we're aware of how these things might play in ourselves. We know that we might see some of this in an organization if we come in as a consultant, or if we're an internal business unit. I've worked for packaging, but I've never worked for the product development. Oh, these guys are kind of like this. I think I see this here. The more you learn about this, and it's never going to be complete, but the more useful you'll be as an analyst and as a professional. And we may not be able to do the peer review of the medical field, but we can definitely do continuing education and keep teaching each other. So,
yeah, Eric, thank you. This is now 1 hour. I think people want to head on for whatever they're up to now, evening, mornings, whatever. Thank you very much. It was a great session. I think the many good points, inspiration, and of course literature. Yeah, there's a lot of, as you said, there's a lot of books written, maybe not for really analysts like us, more in the scientific field, but we have to learn and really get some wisdom out of them, because yes, there are biases all over, and we all tend to fall into all these traps. So thank you very much for this wonderful session.
Thanks a lot for having me, and I'm easy to get in touch with. So
yeah, please, if you can. That's it.
I'm easy to get in touch with, and see you guys online and see you around.
Yeah, and on the last slide, which we had on for 20 minutes already, you've seen another webinar of our series, of our Insight series coming up. That's for the 2nd of December. from Louis Mitchell, South Africa, talking about CI for large construction projects. And yes, there was a little table about ICI workshops actually next week in London. You can presumably join. Yes, you still can join these workshops. And yeah, see you there. See you whenever we have another webinar, or of course in our next ICI conference in May next year in Amsterdam. So thanks for attending. Have a great time and fun implementing all the bias or counter bias as we learned it for today. Okay, bye.
Thanks.